An extraordinary dam on a Welsh hillside.
It's hard to believe that something could have taken out that whole middle section.
On the west coast of America, a deceptively peaceful gateway to hell.
This was a real contrast to what many of them knew was to come.
In Belarus, a defensive structure that had a huge impact on European history.
Were it not for this small but mighty fortress, a lot more Europeans might be speaking French today.
And a baffling ancient wonder in Mexico.
You have all of these massive arches that really just dominate the landscape.
Decaying relics. Shadows of lost worlds. Ruins haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. In San Francisco Bay, a cluster of relics sit marooned on a hilly island.
You'll come across what look like defensive structures, and you'll see in some areas there were gun emplacements.
Clearly this was a place with, great military or naval significance.
But when was it used, and who was it working against?
Elsewhere, an assortment of bucolic structures conceal a dark history.
There are some that look like quaint little houses. It almost looks like a little holiday village.
It's like a retreat or some place that you would go to rest and relax, but it's completely empty, completely deserted.
Who lived in these pretty houses, and what conflict shattered their lives? On Angel Island, Ranger Casey Dexter Lee enjoys sifting through layers of history.
One of the nice things about exploring around Angel Island is even someone like me who's lived and worked here for 20 years, I'm still discovering new things. Even buildings I've been in before, there's details that you'll notice when you return that really, get you excited.
The ruins here date back to the 19th century.
With the beginning of the Civil War in 1861, public concern over the lack of defenses in the San Francisco Bay continued to mount.
This is Camp Reynolds, a garrison for up to 700 men, and the first to be built on Angel Island.
Camp Reynolds was built in 1863 to help as defense during the American Civil War, to protect San Francisco from attack from the Confederacy.
At first, Angel Island seemed like one of the U.S. Army's most desirable postings.
First room here is the library, and it's connected by these archways into the parlor. There was also a large room over here where gatherings would have taken place, and there's a large brick fireplace in there.
Overall, this place looks like a paradise for a soldier.
In 1864, there was an inspection, and one of the people in that group was Mark Twain. And he wrote about Camp Reynolds, calling it a pleasant little village. I can see that little village that Mark Twain was talking about, but this place has a darker side.
As it turns out, soldiers posted here were sent off to some pretty awful combat.
When the American Civil War ended in 1865, the soldiers stationed on Angel Island were looking forward to some well-earned rest. But before long, they were facing the grim prospect of yet another war.
As Americans were pushing further west and towards the Pacific, these tensions between Americans and Native Americans grew violent, and this is known as the Indian Wars.
Native American attacks on white settlers who had encroached on their lands were common. By the 1870s, the US government had forced them into reservations.
and the native people say enough and start fighting back.
It was only a matter of time before the 2 U.S. Army companies on Angel Island were sent to keep the peace.
If you were a soldier sent to Angel Island, there was a pretty high probability you were going to be sent to fight these warring tribes in the West. And the troops here, scouted, provided guards and escorts, and generally patrolled the American West during this tumultuous period. They would be sent wherever they were needed, wherever there was an outbreak of fighting in the Indian Wars.
The men of Camp Reynolds usually had a nervous wait for the enemy to show themselves.
These battles were fought viciously without quarter, so there would have been high anxiety among troops here, wondering where they would be deployed and against whom.
Over in Oregon, rebels from the Modoc tribe were refusing to stay on a reservation far from their ancestral lands. They were led by a warrior named Kintapoos, known to the white settlers as Captain Jack.
Captain Jack ended up fleeing the reservation that the U.S. government had placed them in, and they instead demanded to be reserved on their own land.
Captain Jack wanted to return home to lands the Modoc had inhabited for 14,000 years.
U.S. cavalry and a company of infantry from Angel Island were sent to defeat them in battle and drive them back to the reservation.
Angel Island was the westernmost outpost of the U.S. Army and the nearest garrison to the Modoc Wars.
They would leave the island by steamer, they'd be dropped at a railhead, they'd be sent into the interior of the country or up a trail into Oregon territory.
By January 1873, Captain Jack was holed up with fewer than 60 warriors in an area of inhospitable terrain called the lava beds. The U.S. Army were closing in.
U.S. troops were approaching what they thought was flat land. And what they didn't know was that the Modoc people were hidden away in a stronghold. U.S. troops expected a quick Modoc surrender, but that is not what happened.
You have this great battle where the American soldiers believe they're going to have an easy go of it. In reality, it's very rugged terrain. It's foggy, it's cold. The Americans just get confused. They're being attacked from all sides, and they finally retreat. And this is a great victory for the Modoc people.
The American troops withdrew to Camp Reynolds.
They would be returned to the island for rest and relaxation and to be reformed into another unit for another operation.
But as the soldiers on Angel Island knew all too well, the war was far from over.
The Modocs would not go down without a fight.
Back on the mainland, President Grant had decided on a different way of dealing with Captain Jack.
He sent a peace commission, one U.S. general, a clergyman to parley with Captain Jack. And Captain Jack, welcomed the peace commission, parleyed with him, was getting nowhere with his demands, so he killed the 2 commissioners.
Though Captain Jack had hoped that killing these 2 peace negotiators would push the Americans to back off, it had the exact opposite effect. The American troops come down hard on the Modoc people.
This provoked a violent reaction from Grant. He sent cavalry troops plus the 12th Regiment from Angel Island, and they pursued Captain Jack, cornered them, fought a battle, defeated them.
After their capture, Captain Jack and 3 others were hanged for their crimes.
Other comrades of the captain faced similarly gruesome fates.
The 2 men who were captured with Captain Jack died in prison and eventually were buried on Angel Island.
The cemetery at Camp Reynolds is no longer here. When the Army left, they removed everyone from the cemetery.
The Modoc War is thought to be the costliest of all the so-called Indian wars.
Both companies from Angel Island suffered heavy casualties in the Modoc War.
The casualties included 53 U.S. soldiers, 17 civilians, 15 Modoc warriors, of whom only 5 of which died in battle.
Following the war, most of the Modoc people were relocated to Oklahoma. During the 1890s, Angel Island reinvented itself completely as a line of defense against an invisible enemy.
The U.S. quarantine station on Angel Island was built in the 1890s to help protect San Francisco from illness that might be brought into the area by ships coming from all over the world. The buildings were kind of spread out so that they could segregate people based on illness, class, race, sex.
And the whole idea behind the quarantine station is that the ship itself would be isolated, fumigated. The immigrants and crew aboard the ship would be taken off and put into the quarantine station, where they would be isolated for 14 days.
With the advance of medicine, the quarantine station gradually became obsolete. The World Wars brought a final burst of life and new construction to the island, before the army finally moved away for good. Angel Island is now a California state park and historical landmark. And as the largest natural island in San Francisco Bay, it's become popular with hikers.
You've got this space that was once for soldiers. Now it's being used by families and enjoyed by people from all across the state and all across the country. On the central Mexican plateau is an engineering masterpiece that once brought life to this arid land.
There's this stunning bridge-like structure that rises over the earth and then disappears at the ends.
It looks like a railroad bridge, but for some kind of miniature train, it's only a couple of feet wide.
The architectural style suggests the vision for this classical-looking ruin was conceived on foreign shores.
When you get close, you see that, first of all, it's very old, and it seems to be built like something that the Romans might have built, or that might have been built in Renaissance Italy.
Nearby are more stone structures and a religious-looking building that don't seem to be connected.
You've got a series of tanks and pools scattered around the place, and then you have what looks like an abandoned chapel.
But how is everything here linked to the massive stone monument and the surrounding desert landscape?
There must have been a good reason for engaging in such an extraordinary act of construction right here at this remote spot.
The idea for this unusual piece of engineering came from a surprising source. Raul Macul Martinez is an archaeologist at the Mexican Ministry of Culture. He spent years sifting through the desert sands to understand how these structures were built.
Y estamos en la gran arquería del Padre Tembleque, Otumba.
The history of the Otumba region is stained in blood, spilt by fighting foreign invaders.
In the early 16th century, Spanish conquistadores began a campaign against the Aztec Empire here in this region of Central America.
Once the Aztec Empire had been vanquished, a period of brutal Spanish occupation began. And there seemed little anyone could do to unite this troubled land.
Los ejércitos españoles empiezan a disgregarse y comienza una cuestión de tomar pueblos cercanos y también los centros urbanos. unos defendiendo sus territorios, sus sitios sagrados a sus dioses, y otros también queriendo imponer el nuevo orden, el orden castellano, el orden europeo.
Key to Spanish culture was their religion.
Everywhere they went, they would bring these Catholic friars who would set up missions and try to convert the native peoples to Catholicism.
The conquistadors also created havoc on the local terrain. The introduction of European farming methods like cattle grazing took a devastating toll on the limited supply of clean water.
If there's one element that defines Otumba and the surrounding regions, it's a scarcity of rivers and fresh water.
El agua era contaminada constantemente por la presencia de los animales, y entonces eso había necesidad de construir algo para hacer más rápida la llegada del agua hacia donde se tenía que conectar, que era básicamente los conventos y las fuentes de agua.
In the mid-1500s, a Spanish priest called Father Tembleque came to Otumba with a solution.
Father Tembleque was an expert in hydraulic theory. The construction of a new and highly elaborate aqueduct was meant to supply Otumba, its residents, and the surrounding region with the fresh water that they needed.
Named after the Catholic clergyman who inspired its creation, this is the aqueduct of Padre Tembleque.
Los religiosos del siglo XVI, muchos de ellos estudiaron en la Universidad de Salamanca, que era uno de los centros educativos y de conocimiento, al menos en España. Y de ahí conocieron pues, los tratados de hidráulica, los tratados del mantenimiento de los acueductos romanos. Llega a este mundo donde descubre, ve, escucha y ve el territorio, ve las necesidades también de la gente, y entonces propone esta gran obra.
Some of the people around him did not have faith in Tembleque's ideas, and they called him Fray Loco de Nada, or crazy friar of nothing.
El plan era tomar agua de los amellales del Cerro del Tecajete, que en realidad es un pequeño volcán, pasarlo por estos desniveles en esta barranca del Papalote y llevarlo a Otumba. De ahí se desviaba para los diferentes conventos que están en el camino.
For this ambitious project to succeed, Father Tembleque needed the help of the indigenous people. But he had to convince skeptical tribal chiefs that a reliable source of drinking water was good news for everyone.
Habla con los Tlatoque, que eran los señores que gobernaban estas tierras, y les propone la construcción de este monumento. Era organización de 20 gentes, de 20 señores en cuadrillas para venir a trabajar y que se rotaran por semana, porque así era el trabajo en la antigüedad. Que no recibían dinero, no recibían paga, recibían alimentación de sus señores, de los que los gobernaban.
But the Spanish were desperately in need of local knowledge.
In Europe, when people built large stone structures, whether it was a cathedral or an aqueduct, they would build an elaborate wooden scaffolding around it as they built it. But out there in the desert, you didn't have sources of timber, and working with wood was not something these local artisans really knew how to do.
But if you actually look at this structure, we can get some clues of how they worked around this issue.
So they came up with a brilliant idea, which was to build, in essence, a structure out of adobe that would rise up as they built the stones, support the stones until they got everything put together, and then they could take the adobe away, and you'd have this beautiful self-supporting stone structure.
Construction began in 1555 and continued for 17 years. While Roman ingenuity inspired the aqueduct's design, it was homegrown expertise that got the job done.
Así se puede resumir muy brevemente la presencia indígena acá. La mano de obra de hombres, de mujeres y de niños y de niñas, y también en la esencia que dejaron en estas piedras.
Another clue to the idea that these local artisans were really invested in this project was the decorations they did, the little paintings, the little insignia, little markings in the rocks.
O sea, esto nos habla de que los pueblos fueron directos constructores de esto y que plasmaban en las paredes una parte de ellos, una parte de las comunidades.
It seemed to say, we're taking some pride in this, and I want to put my John Hancock on this arch that I built because it's a big deal.
The building of this waterway would not have been possible were it not for the indigenous people and their knowledge.
When complete, the entire canal system stretched for 30 miles.
The channel carrying water was only about a foot across. But if that channel's full of water all day and all night, that's a lot of water. Now they had a system that distributed water all year round.
And for the next few centuries, water continued to flow along this engineering marvel that had been inspired by ancient technology. But over time, the mountain spring that supplied it began to dry up, and new sources of water had to be found.
Quedó en desuso también por razones de descuido, del abandono de las cañerías, de la presencia de maleza, de tierra, que esto también hacía imposible el tránsito del agua.
The monument stands as an enduring reminder of the clash between two worlds.
What remains today is this fusion of two distinct cultures and ideas. You have this Mesoamerican knowledge of construction with this Roman hydraulics, and the two exist together in this aqueduct.
Cuando inicia la construcción de este acueducto, pues había una incredulidad total de lograrlo, de terminarlo y también de que funcionara. Las comunidades son orgullosas de ver que sus ancestros construyeron esto.
On a remote hillside in Wales, a collection of stone relics have somehow survived the centuries.
Looking around in the valley, you see a lot of these old structures.
There are homes here, as well as signs of industry.
As we make our way up this valley, we see these two strange, thick walls.
And it looks a bit higgledy-piggledy, but it's definitely been placed there deliberately.
The whole middle section of the wall is completely missing, and through the gap flows a small little river.
What catastrophe could have caused this well-built wall to collapse?
If there's a failure in either the masonry structure or an explosive failure, then you're basically sitting on a bomb of energy.
As the pieces of this stone jigsaw come together, a historically significant picture begins to emerge.
This valley was pivotal to British history for several reasons.
David James's family has lived in the Elan Valley for generations. He knows how to read the clues here.
So we're walking towards the entrance of the mine shaft. There was metal work here to lift the lead ore out of the mine.
So lead is one of those wonder materials, and Wales is very, very lucky. It sits on some of the world's best lead supplies.
Originally, you would have had a big opening here, a nice big square opening. with a timber frame around it, and just went a long way down, 240 feet eventually, with levels going off.
Lead has been mined here for thousands of years.
The Romans mined in the area as well, going back 1000 BC, where they mined lead, which they mainly made water pipes, ornaments, and coffins from.
Over the millennia, extensive infrastructure gradually developed.
So we're walking now towards one of the 2 water wheels that was built at the mine here. The water wheel was basically like an engine, if you like.
By the 18th and 19th century, Britain becomes the center of lead mining in Europe.
The Elan Valley became a hive of industry as people flocked to work here.
Working men came from all over the valley and walked many miles to work here. The miners lodged in the different cottages and farms spread throughout the Elan Valley here.
You would have had whole families that, clustered around these lead pits.
But there are also some seemingly unrelated structures hidden here.
You've got bricks inside and outside, and then the concrete, reinforced concrete in between. The walls are roughly about 1.5 feet thick.
They're leftovers from the Second World War. All they're designed to do is hold a man, a gun, and defend an area that he can see directly from it. They line up one after the other, and you create a wall of fortification.
In here, you have the window for the marksmen to point their guns out of.
These gun ports face down the valley towards a series of lakes which have been man-made, but for no apparent reason. But directly downstream from Elan Valley is the city of Birmingham and its vast industrial hinterland.
In the late 19th century, Birmingham needed a better source of fresh water as their population grew. They constructed a series of dams to impound the water in this valley.
It took almost 10 years to lay 73 miles of underground pipe, build 4 dams, and flood 850 acres of the Elan Valley, submerging a manor house and a lead miner's village. By the time of the Second World War, water from the Welsh valleys had helped Birmingham grow into a center of ordnance, armaments, and vehicle manufacture.
The British were worried that the Germans might try to attack and take out these dams.
This was the German planning for Operation Sea Lion, their eventual takeover of the British Isles. And so the British were on guard against attacks on key infrastructure.
The overgrown fortifications were built to guard Birmingham's crucial water supply. But one dam has been blasted apart.
So what we had here was Nanty Grove Dam. It was stretched across the Nanty Grove stream here. It's 35 foot high and full of water. And as you can see, the middle of the section of the dam was completely blown away.
By the start of the war, the Nanty Grove Dam had become redundant.
The Nanty Grove Dam was a substantial structure in its time, originally built for the workers living in the area, but times had moved on and it wasn't needed anymore.
But with the onset of war, the out-of-use dam came into its own when it attracted the attention of the British inventor and aeronautical engineer, Barnes Wallis.
Barnes Wallis began thinking about what it was going to take to damage German infrastructure. The British knew there were a number of dams on Germany's Ruhr River. If they could knock out 1, 2, 3 of these dams, it could set the Germans back months or years.
So Barnes was starting from scratch here. How could he take out a huge dam behind enemy lines?
No existing aircraft was capable of carrying a bomb big enough to blast the dams from the air. So Barnes-Wallis started by experimenting with naval torpedoes.
But the Germans had already thought of this, and they had assembled an array of underwater nets to protect these dams from just this risk.
Wallis had to find a way to blow up the dams using smaller bombs.
He needs to find a place in the UK where he can try out this dam-busting concept.
And that's where the Natty Grand came in. It's only a fifth of the size of the dams that they were aiming for in Germany. But if they could get it to work on this one, there was a good chance that if they scaled it up, it would work behind enemy lines.
But the Nantigro Dam wasn't that easy to destroy.
The first experiment was done in May 1942, and even though it was spectacular, it didn't cause much damage to the dam.
It goes off successfully, but barely dents the dam structure itself. They need to think bigger.
They come back in July 1942 with a bigger bomb, a 279-pound explosive, dangled it from the centre of the dam under the water and remotely detonated it, and boom! It blew a hole in the dam you see today. 60 foot wide the hole is. And if you come through here, what we have here is the remains of the other side of the dam. And if you look down here, is the bottom of the dam was left and the rest was blown away.
This experiment proved that if you could get a big enough explosion just below the waterline, you could blow the masonry apart and then use the pressure of the water built up behind the dam, use all of that energy to tear apart the structure itself. You're onto a winner.
Now they have to figure out the tactics of skipping that bomb up against the wall of the dam.
Wallis thought, what if I can build a bomb that could bounce along the top of the water over the nets that Germans had assembled to protect their dams?
After the Nantigro trials, the bouncing bomb was successfully tested on other British reservoirs. And in May 1943, Barnes-Wallis's invention successfully destroyed 2 German dams, marking a major turning point for the Allies in the Second World War. Back at the broken dam in Wales, enthusiasts like David continue to unearth secrets.
I absolutely love the history of the Elan Valley. It goes back as far back as the Bronze Age and is still making history today.
On the flatlands of central Belarus sits a small collection of ruins with a big history.
All across the site, there's a real hodgepodge of different types of buildings from different periods, some ancient, some more modern.
Ceilings have caved in, walls have collapsed, and the greenery and grass look like they're almost swallowing the structures up.
Spanning just 100 acres, the secrets here are cleverly concealed.
It's not all about the surface. Underneath, there's lots and lots of tunnels, lots and lots of places to get lost.
These underground military structures help to shape the destiny of Europe.
Were it not for this small but mighty fortress, the situation might have turned out very differently. A lot more Europeans might be speaking French today.
Local historian Sergei Shantsev has been studying this place for many years.
С моим другом приходили сюда. Нам было интересно изучать вот эти все фортификационные сооружения, все эти здания, подвалы.
This is the Bobruisk Fortress. Its story is linked to one of the most infamous men in European history, Napoleon Bonaparte.
In the early 19th century, most of the European continent was under French rule and the power of the mighty Napoleon Bonaparte.
Back then, these ruins and the country of Belarus were part of the Russian Empire, the sworn enemy of Napoleon and his allies.
Various plans were drawn up for the defense of the Russian Empire, and one suggested a series of fortresses along the rivers on the western side of the empire.
Construction began in 1810. A series of state-of-the-art strongholds would block Napoleon's path into Russia. The town of Bobruisk was critical to the defense of Moscow.
This was a key spot on the river, a tactical advantage to create a fortification. You could stop a huge number of people moving from A to B in this particular spot.
The Russian Tsar threw everything he had at building a fortress to defend his empire against a powerful enemy.
Napoleon didn't do things by halves. He raised a massive, massive army, a huge number of men, and started approaching the Russian border.
Using troops from all over his European territories, he raised an army that's estimated to have been between 450 and 650,000 soldiers. This was the largest invasion force that had ever been put together in European history.
With fewer than half Napoleon's troops, the Russian commanders were facing almost certain defeat.
Napoleon expected a quick victory. He thought he could push straight through to the capture of Moscow, the capital.
He was determined to get to Moscow and meet the Russian army in open battle.
Napoleon Bonaparte was a scrapper. He was a fighter. He was really wanted to get up close and punch the enemy. And he had thousands of troops behind him.
But this time, Napoleon's daredevil tactics worked against him.
What he wasn't expecting was for the Russians to retreat.
With Napoleon hot on their heels, the Russian army retreated more than 100 miles, heading for the safest place it knew, the Bobruisk Fortress.
This was the only fortress on the route to Moscow that had the infrastructure that could hold out against a determined assault.
When the Russian troops made it to Bobruisk, they received a warm welcome. They found medical supplies, they found food, and they found a defensive, safe place to stay.
When the French army finally reached Bobruisk, Napoleon was expecting to find the Russians lined up for a glorious battle. But all that remained was a small garrison of men cowering in the fort. The clever design of the Tsar's fortress meant that even the great French leader was unable to conquer it.
За моей спиной находится оборонительный ров Бобруйской крепости. Он оборудовался противопехотными колами, то есть брусьями, которые были заточены и располагались на дне этого рва, чтобы избежать проникновения Бобруйской крепости. Их было порядка 300 орудий. Это были серьезные орудия, которые, в общем-то, могли нанести серьезный урон, ущерб неприятельским войскам.
If anyone steps into that zone, they are risking getting a huge, huge set of explosives sent their way.
The well-planned kill zone prevented Napoleon from taking the fort. So he left behind a detachment of 10,000 men to lay siege and starve out the Russian troops holed up inside. But thanks to the ingenuity of the Bobruisk planners, the Russian garrison had one more trick up its sleeve to thwart Napoleon's plans.
Минные галереи, мы находимся под землей, ориентировочно, приблизительно на глубине это около 5-6 метров. Минные галереи были построены для того, чтобы выходить с территории крепости под землей, делать разведывательную деятельность, диверсионную. То есть это было придумано уникальное.
During the siege, they used the tunnels to sneak out and spy on the army, collecting vital intelligence that could then be forwarded to the Russian Army High Command.
Meanwhile, the Russian troops at Bobruisk continued to hold out. Napoleon drove his exhausted men on towards Moscow, expecting to find the Russian army there. When they arrived, they were met by an extraordinary sight.
When Napoleon's depleted Grand Armée finally reached Moscow, to their utter disbelief, they find it abandoned and scorched to the ground as well.
The Russians had already left. They'd already moved out. They were not going to engage in the fight. And Napoleon and his already stretched, depleted, unhappy troops found an empty city.
With winter approaching and food supplies dwindling, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat. But there was one big problem blocking his path home. Bobruisk Fortress had still not fallen.
При отступлении из Москвы войска Наполеона были изрядно потрепаны, можно сказать так, и ему нужно было где-то укрыться, где-то перевести дух, да, поправить свое материальное положение раненых. Но сделать ему это было негде, потому что Бобруйская крепость сдана ему не была в 12 году. И, в общем-то, это нанесло ему сокрушительное поражение.
The fortress was never taken. For the great Napoleon Bonaparte, it was a calamitous humiliation.
The Napoleonic invasion of Russia is one of the greatest military disasters of all time. And that is really the beginning of the end for Napoleon. Within 2 years, Napoleon is going to have to abdicate and go into exile.
Today, the Bobruisk Fortress lies silent and crumbling.
Почему для меня это важно? Я рядом здесь проживал. Здесь служил мой отец. Он здесь окончил службу, ушел в запас в звании майора. Вот. И тут мне, в общем-то, каждый кустик, каждое здание